Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time covering two books. One is Eric Vuillard's War of the Poor. I hope that pronunciation of the name is anything close to correct. And the other is Lyndal Roper's Summer of Fire and Blood. And these two books are both basically covering the same historical period. War of the Poor is very short, and it is more like kind of a brief nonfiction essay, kind of a little bit of fictionalized retelling in some places, and really is more like one kind of small slice through of this event, the German Peasants' War, where Summer of Fire and Blood is this kind of really quite large and quite exhaustive discussion of the entirety of the Peasants' War, and doesn't focus nearly so much on any single figure the way that War of the Poor is really about this character, Thomas Munzer, who is a figure who has gone down in history with a number of different opinions on him, but he was this sort of um, apocalyptic preacher who was a rabble rouser or a leader of the people, or however different ways you might think about him in this period, the essentially the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Um, and Munzer is the protagonist, I guess, of the War of the Poor. A lot of that one is mostly about him and his kind of version of this German Peasants' War, where Summer of Fire and Blood is about the larger Peasants' War as a whole, and kind of situating it in the broader understanding of the history of Central Europe at the time, a lot more about the Protestant Reformation in general and the way it kind of tied in with this, and excuse me, a lot of kind of cultural discussion of, why were these sort of things happening, and how did people at the time feel about like the peasantry versus the gentry, and these kind of class distinctions, and a lot of discussion about the particulars of the nature of the peasant, uh, various articles, and the issues that they raised, and the way that the peasants thought about these issues in their own lives, and essentially an attempt to kind of reframe a lot of the discussion of the German Peasants' War away from this kind of very top-down leader-centric view and into much more of a sense of the kind of broad participation of people from all of these different backgrounds and all of these different places, all sort of involved together in this large project that didn't have a whole lot of antecedents, and didn't really have a lot of repetition either until like basically the French Revolution. And so there is something kind of fascinating and almost unique about this particular historical event. So yeah, War of the Poor, like I said, is very short. It's the Goodreads lists it as about 100 pages on Kindle, and I think it is shorter than that as I read it, or it felt like it was shorter than that. Vuillard has also written a book called The Order of the Day, which is how I found out about this one, I think, because apparently that one is quite good and has won some prizes and all that. The people on Goodreads are mad about this one being considered for the Booker Prize, apparently, because it is so short. And I don't know how much that matters either way, but I thought it was pretty good. It's, like I said, a discussion of this character, Thomas Munzer, and it's a really, um, there's a real flavor to the way that that discussion is carried, and all of these other kind of minor historical elements that are brought in to play. There's some discussion of other peasant rebellions of Wat Tyler and Jack Cade in England, and these kind of different peasants uprisings that were not necessarily of the same character, but maybe have some inherent similarity. And this sort of idea of the kind of continual struggle between the poor and the oppressed of Munster's day, and the rich, the landowning nobles who want to reinstitute serfdom in places where it has gone out of fashion, and all of these different kind of exploitative measures by the nobility and the uprising against them, and the way that that is violently put down, and all of that. And then, like I said, Summer of Fire and Blood is fairly different. It is about the same material. It probably has about as much kind of total space on the page about Thomas Munzer, but it really gets into a lot of the broader details of the nature of the Peasants' War, what Germany was like at the beginning of the 16th century, a lot of discussion of kind of other uprisings, other chaos in the world at the time, and especially in Germany at the time, and the kind of way that Martin Luther's actions and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation ended up in some ways setting the stage for the German Peasants' War, even if Martin Luther himself came to be fairly antagonistic towards most of the leaders of the Peasants' War, and fairly opposed seemingly to a lot of their goals and actions. Anyway, and so there's this kind of discussion of the nature of the leaders and all the different backgrounds of people, the way that the different bands interacted with each other and with these small villages and towns, the way that a number of major figures from this period and from the Peasants' War itself had very different backgrounds. And so, some of them are like Munzer, they're preachers of this kind of new flavor, preaching in German instead of in Latin, and all of that. But then there's also characters. There's, one of the leaders is a knight who is apparently, according to his memoirs, elected to lead a band in absentia, and is told as he's sitting out at a tavern that he's been chosen to lead this band, and he tries to reject that, and then they say, "Oh no, you're gonna lead us to battle," and all that. So there's all these kind of small and details about the nature of the event as kind of a broader historical period rather than this kind of singular narrative. um, Summer of Fire and Blood, I would say, is a very detailed treatment of a lot of this stuff, and it, I think, suffers in some places as someone who does not have a very strong background in the period or in the geography of Germany or anything like that. I found myself having to look up, like, where things were and what regions we were dealing with, and the relationship, the geographical relationship between places mentioned a fair bit to keep track of what was going on. I didn't necessarily feel like the book did a great job of conveying that, but obviously for anyone who already knows that material, that's not as much of a problem. And not every historical um, treatise is going to have a kind of as much of a quality treatment of like lots of maps the way that like an atlas might or something. Or I'm thinking especially of the landmark histories line that is classical histories with all of these different atlas elements, and maps and images from archaeological sites and all these different things like that. So anyway, it also probably didn't help that I read it on Kindle, and so the included front maps did not show up very well, as you might imagine. So it's a little harder to use those, and probably in paper it would be a lot easier to just flip back to those and have a better idea of the geography. But that was kind of the only real issue that I experienced reading this one, that I felt like I was lost without some extra sources a couple of times. following along the the movements of different bands between different villages and all that sort of stuff. But other than that, I will say Summer of Fire and Blood, I think, is a really exhaustive look at the period. And if you are really into a very deeply and richly presented version of this particular history, that it's totally worth checking out and being interested in and reading about, because it is a really fascinating period of history, and there's so much kind of stuff going on in it. And it's a period of history that, in addition to being fascinating, is also not necessarily very well covered, especially in non-academic sources. And so, even though I felt like it was a little harder to follow something like Summer of Fire and Blood, as someone who does not have a strong background in the period, I definitely felt like with a little extra work, I was able to follow it well enough to be really interested in this period that like I said, is kind of hard to find good sources on. There's not a lot of good English language treatments of all of this material other than this one, as far as I can tell. So that certainly is something to recommend. This particular one, and both of these, I think I would say I recommend. War of the Poor, like I said, is really short, and you can totally. I think I read it in an afternoon in basically one sitting, and I think you totally could do the same probably and have lots of fun. And in my case, I read the War of the Poor and then read one or two other things and then came back to Summer of Fire and Blood, and I think that was really good because that kind of gave me a sense of the easy to get into, the shorter and more narrative version of the story, to kind of set the stakes a little better, and then the longer and more exhaustive treatment of the history as the follow up, to kind of understand more deeply what was going on. And I think that worked well for me. So, not that anybody necessarily has to do that, but if you were to read both of these, that might be a way to do it, because that's what worked for me. Anyway, yeah, two quality books that are both sort of nonfiction. War of the Poor is a little bit more of a kind of fictionalized treatment in some places, a little closer to historical fiction than kind of pure nonfiction on some level, I would say, but is also history. So anyway, both of those quite good. Check out The War of the Poor and Summer of Fire and Blood for everything you might want to know about the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525. But that is going to be it for me for today. If you have read either of these, if you know about them, if you have any other sources on the period that you think that I ought to check out, leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.